Mrs. Sparrow had just returned to her nest with a plastic bag in her beak, carrying a few cooked rice grains for her hungry chicks. As she was about to feed them, a mischievous crow, who had been hiding like an expert thief, swooped in and snatched the bag, flying away in an instant. Poor Mrs. Sparrow, who had worked so hard to gather food, could only watch helplessly. Her chicks chirped loudly in distress. In the courtyard below, Simon was studying for his exams. He had been sitting there for the past 3 days, and he had noticed the crow's mischief before. When he heard the loud chirping of the sparrow's chicks, he paused for a moment, lost in thought. Then, determined, he got up and put his plan into action before returning to his studies. Now all he had to do was wait for the next day. The next morning, Mrs. Sparrow was flying back to her nest with a soft piece of bread in her beak when she noticed something unusual. The mischievous crow was lying motionless under a tree. "Brother Crow, what happened?" she asked, concerned as she flew closer. "I have a fever, Sister Sparrow. I'm too weak to go and find food," the crow replied weakly, resting his head on the ground. Hearing this, Mrs. Sparrow immediately placed her bread and a small piece of cheese in front of him. "Here, eat this. I'll go find more food for my chicks," she said kindly. "Thank you so much, sister," the crow muttered. "Helping each other in times of need is the right thing to do," Mrs. Sparrow replied before flying off. As soon as she was gone, the crow fluffed his feathers, sat up, and greedily ate the food. "Silly sparrow," he chuckled to himself. Days passed, and the mischievous crow was nowhere to be seen. Mrs. Sparrow's chicks were delighted, thinking they were finally free of his trouble. Then, suddenly, the crow returned. Wasting no time, he tried to steal the food Mrs. Sparrow had brought for her chicks. But this time, as he attempted to fly away, he got tangled in a thin string and became trapped. Simon, who had been observing from afar, had assumed that the crow had changed his ways. But when he saw him struggling in the string, he walked up and said, "Oh, Crow, I thought you had reformed, but you're still the same. You still steal what isn't yours. Now, stay tangled up. This is your punishment." With that, Simon turned and walked back inside. The crow, caught in the string, reflected on all the tricks he had played on the innocent sparrows. Regret filled his heart, and tears welled up in his eyes. His stolen food slipped from his beak and fell to the ground. Mrs. Sparrow's chicks chirped joyfully. They were finally going to be free of the troublemaking crow. But Mrs. Sparrow looked at him with sorrow. After thinking for a moment, she flew down and began trying to free him. "Don't do it, Sister Sparrow," the crow said in a low voice. "This is my punishment." "No, Brother Crow," she replied gently. "The fact that you realize your mistake is enough." The crow lowered his head in shame. At that moment, Simon stepped out of the house, preparing to go to the store. Seeing Mrs. Sparrow trying to free the crow, he sighed and walked up to them. Carefully, he untangled the string from the crow's legs. "This is an act of kindness from Mrs. Sparrow," Simon said firmly. "Even after all the trouble you caused her, she still chose to help you. I hope you've truly learned your lesson. From now on, find your own food. Don't take what belongs to others." The crow nodded in agreement. Grateful, he thanked them both and flew away. "Did you see that, kids?" Simon said, looking at the sparrow's chicks. "Mrs. Sparrow's kindness changed the mischievous crow. Just like her, we too can make a difference with kindness and good manners. So let's promise to always care for others as well as ourselves."